also has to be seen on a larger level how the corporate sectors have been manipulating the newspapers and controlling the things. But however, in the ground, there is a tremendous movement, it is amazable movement. You can't even imagine. We students actually, I can't talk on behalf of all of you, but on behalf of me at least I can say, we tend to feel always that we fail. For example, 2-3 days we protest and then feel, okay, this administration, I'm just giving an example, administration is like that. But you just imagine a Vedanta protest which Adivasis are doing it tremendously. Even now they have been doing so much police cases, so much in the name of Maoist attack or in the name of police attack. So much of tremendous pressures and terrorism which the state executes on these people, but still you can find that movement there. That is where we all academical students actually have to learn a spirit from that. Saying this as a background, I would invite Felix onto the dais. And anyway, this would be my last talk also. This is my first talk actually. Anyway, I would invite my respectable Professor Bhagya Bhukia. He have really taught us many things. And also ActionAid sir. Raghu sir. Anyway, for a cheer up, he would start his violin. I hope that was not Carnatic music. Sorry. Sir, I now ask Bhagya Bhukia, sir, what formality?
Welcome you all friends once again on behalf of Department of Social Exclusion Studies and ActionAid Hyderabad. At the outset, I thank Felix Padel for accepting our invitation and to be with us for this evening. Really thank you, sir. Actually, I mean, so this initiative came from ActionAid Hyderabad. They have this democracy dialogue. So as a part of this, we invited Ravi, just reduce. So as a part of this initiative, we are organizing this. Hope we'll continue this tradition further. Let us see. As you know, the question of democracy and development are most contentious things. Democracy on the face, it looks like very secular and inclusive and all that, but at the same time it excludes the large section of the people. The experience of our past, particularly the Adivasi experience, shown us that how democracy can exclude the people as well as the development as well. Now, so we are completely caught by development paradigms, but what is this development, what for this development, whom for this development are very important questions. As a friend Ravichandran was saying, now if you go to the tribal areas, now there is a complete war kind of situation. Particularly in Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh and parts of Andhra Pradesh, some of the districts, Adilabad, Warangal, and Khammam, Vizag. Okay, so how to recover from this? So how can we think up and evaluate development with human face, where the Adivasis can actually actively participate in the development process and democratization process. So I don't want to be between Felix and you, but before that I request Raghu Garu to say a few things on the democracy dialogue. Then Felix will speak, and after the speech we'll have question and answer session. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Bhagya. Actually, it's our privilege to be here with Professor Felix, Professor Bhagya, and with all of you here. ActionAid, actually, as an organization, we work on the issues of poverty and injustice across the world. We work in about 40 plus countries. And in India, we are working in about 20 plus states. We have 12 regional offices operating across the country. And we work with many excluded communities, tribals, Dalits, fishing community, women, urban poor, and many actually. While working with the excluded communities, our focus is mainly on their livelihoods and their rights over, mainly the rights over and their rights access over natural resources on which they survive. We are also working with the tribals for so many, about 20 plus years. I also interacted with many people who are working with tribals. Whenever I interact with tribals, many of them say that the reason for working with tribals is mainly to develop them, or to build awareness, or to work on various issues of development like education, health, etc. But I rarely heard a response saying that we are here also to learn from them, to learn from their worldview, to learn from their traditional knowledge, to learn from their actually understanding of the nature. Very few of them actually. Our understanding of tribals, our work with tribals actually is based on the premise that there is a lot even to learn from them. And the way we work with the tribals is to support them in terms of their assertion over their natural resources. And if we look around the issues, the many issues they have been facing, in the name of development and democracy, these are the two processes that really exclude them and alienate them from the society and the so-called society, and then marginalize them further. Actually, these are in the name of irrigation projects, in the name of mining, in the name of infrastructure development, in the name of wildlife sanctuaries, in the name of even the many development process, roads formations, and then many others. They are displaced. I think many of you may know the tribals consists of about 8% of this population. But out of total displaced, 40% of them, 40% of the displaced are tribals in this country. In the past 60 years, about 60 million plus, 40% of them are tribals actually. So we can understand how this development and democracy excluded the tribals. And the initiative of dialogue on democracy, we are trying to most of our work is mainly limited to the excluded communities, but while working on the issues and in order to have larger alliances to expand our struggles for the rights of the marginalized sections, we thought of reaching out to other sections of the society, academicians, intellectuals, students, etc. As part of this, we are trying to have this dialogue and have these interactions and many such processes. And we would like to continue this also. And we are thankful to Professor Felix, who accepted to be with us to share his views on the topic. And I welcome Dr. Felix and to speak.
Thank you, Raghu Garu. I don't think Felix need any introduction. You must have seen his books outside this hall. Some of his titles and also mine are now kept in the outside. It's a very, very renowned scholar, particularly on the Adivasis. He lived with them and he experienced their life. So he wrote all those books from his own experience. So he'll be the right person actually to speak on the Adivasis, particularly democracy and development, how it is happening in the tribal areas. So now I request Felix to start his presentation.
Friends, I feel very honored and give many thanks to Raghubhai and to Professor Pangia for inviting me here. I'm going to talk about, in a way, what is real democracy, what is real development, where does one find it? And I'm particularly talking about the tribal areas, but my first book actually was spending a lot of time in the tribal areas, but making a study of my own society, the British, as they were in India, through the records and through other things, of the power structure, through the administrators, the soldiers, the missionaries, and the anthropologists, of what they believed in, what they acted, the social structure of the British in India, which leads on to the social structure of the power structure as it is in the country now, because in some ways the changes are not as much as one might hope. But so in some ways my view is from the tribal areas. It's like a bottoms-up approach. And I'm going to be talking about what is democracy, what is development, also not just in the tribal areas, but in the world at large. And on that note, sometimes I like to mix a bit of music with words, because words are so misused. The words democracy, the word development have been very badly misused. So I'm going to start by playing a song from Bob Dylan, from the American singer. And actually in America too, there are quite profound movements at the moment for real democracy. So it's in that spirit that I would like to bring that here. Would you mind to just hold it while
Yeah, please.
How many roads must a man walk down before you can call him a man? Yes, and how many seas must a white dove sail before she sleeps in the sand? Yes, and how many years can a mountain exist before it's washed to the sea? Yes, and how many years can some people exist before they're allowed to be free? How many times can a man turn his head and pretend that he just cannot see? The answer is blowing in the wind. Thank you. That's just a kind of introduction to set the scene, as it were. And excuse my British accent singing an American song. If you look at what's happening in the tribal areas right now, it's a situation really horrendous to witness for anybody who's seen it develop over the years, with what is, in a way, the Maoist situation and the counter-insurgency operations. I would actually say it's maybe the worst war there has ever been in India. And I don't say that lightly. I know Indian history fairly well, but because this is, in a way, a war that is tearing apart the fabric of the village people who have lived in these areas in central India for many centuries. My own work was on the Kond tribe, who are the largest tribe in Orissa, and many of you will know about the Niyamgiri movement that I've been part of, in a way, and the recent order by the Supreme Court for Gram Sabha decisions from the Dongria villages about whether they want mining by Vedanta, and the very decisive results that they don't want it. In a way, that gives a lot of hope to many people I know, because it seems to be an example of grassroots democracy that is really working. And what is also very heartening about it is that the Adivasis and the Dalits have come to this together. They were both voting against mining, both the Dalit and the Adivasi villages. And in the light of what Ravi was saying about the Kondamahar violence that has tended to create a lot of tension between the scheduled tribes and scheduled castes, it's particularly heartening. And in terms of the people's right over the local resources, I would say it's quite a historic situation that has developed there. And in a way, it was quite enlightened of the Supreme Court to give this order for the Gram Sabha decision. And it was also, the Orissa government has also implemented, although they made it only in 12 villages, but the result from those 12 villages has been decisive. So one can take some hope from that in a situation that in hundreds of other areas is very, very depressing indeed. So why the tribal areas? I suppose when I first began to get to know the tribal areas, I was very moved by many things about tribal society. It's not to say that everything about traditional tribal society is good and other societies are bad. It's not to give a romantic view. I very strongly reject any idea that what I'm saying is a romanticization of tribal people, because there are superstitions, there is blood sacrifice, there is human sacrifice, there is witchcraft, there are negative features about society. But if you look at the positive features, just to list a few, one is that these are societies that have lived in a real kind of harmony with nature over many centuries. And that is based on Nigam, that is why Niyam Raja is the deity of the Dongria, that the rules about restraint, of not to take too much from nature. And that is where tribal society is very different from most mainstream societies, that in a way, especially mainstream modern so-called highly developed society is been taking from nature far, far too much. So that knowledge, and I was very moved by what Raghu also said, it's the knowledge about nature, meaning the forest, meaning about patterns of cultivation, meaning about water and how to channel it, the details of nature, the medicinal plants, animals, birds, insects, enormous stores of knowledge that are still there. Maybe they are more under attack now, but they're still there. Another aspect is an emphasis on sharing. That if you look at modern society, especially capitalistic society, there is a very strong emphasis on competition. And especially among economists, competition is usually almost taken as a sign of a healthy economy, that if you have companies competing with each other, none is going to take a monopoly. That might be the simplistic idea. But this emphasis on competition, you also see it in education, where you have children streamlined, and those who say what the teachers want to hear, and a particular form of knowledge, what they learn by rote, maybe they become a kind of educated elite that is sometimes very narrow-minded. Then in law, you find the legal system is utterly competitive. You have, in any legal case, which might often depend on lawyers' fees, so poor people are very disadvantaged in it, although everybody is meant to be equal before the law. You have one party will be a winner and one party will be a loser. And if you look at Adivasi society, in the traditional form of law, the aim of that law is nearly always reconciliation. So whichever party might be right or wrong, the process itself will bring out voices, it'll bring out the truth. People express themselves very strongly and openly in front of everybody. And then at the end, usually the panchayat might give a bigger fine to one side than the other, but those fines go to pay for a feast of reconciliation. And this, it's almost unimaginable if you go to a local court or a high court or the Supreme Court, that kind of reconciliation at the end, it's almost unimaginable. So in things like that, you could say that tribal societies are very highly developed. So the usual idea of tribal societies is they're backward or they're primitive. And I'm utterly questioning that concept, that there are many paths of development, and when you try to impose one model of development onto another form of society, there is a tremendous violence implicit in that. Also, in some ways, you can say there are forms of democracy in tribal societies that go very deep. For example, the Khon's name for themselves is Kuinga, and almost the beginning point of Indian history is when Ashoka waged war on the Kalinga more than 2,200 years ago. And on his inscriptions, he says, in the Kalinga war, 100,000 people were killed. 150,000 people were enslaved, and many times that number died from disease and famine as a result of the war. And the implication is that he is kind of confessing that he was wrong to make that war, but he still formed an administration based on that. And he also kind of threatens the forest tribes that they have to obey the Dharma as his system defines it. So, and the Kalinga and the Kuinga of the Khons, personally I'm quite sure that the Kalinga are basically the Khons. And if you see, even during British times, the Khons were gradually retreating from the coastal areas of Orissa to more inland where they are now. And so in a way, the Dongriya Khons, who are one of the most traditional parts of the Khons, when they are standing up to Vedanta, it's not just some primitive tribe, kind of a David Goliath kind of thing. They have a history that goes back for over 2,000 years, and a language and a very sophisticated culture in balance with the environment. So it is, I want to remind of that history. And also, if you look at another epic struggle in Orissa, where the outcome has been completely the opposite, in Kalinga Nagar, if you bear in mind this history of the Kalinga, that the Kalinga, whoever they were the indigenous people of Orissa, and a genocide was committed by Ashoka's forces when he first came in. And so to build a series of steel plants in the name of the Kalinga, and then when you have Tata Steel, if you know, in January 2006, when the police opened fire, when Tata Steel was trying to begin the construction of its steel plants, 13 or 14 Adivasis were killed. A policeman was also killed. And since then, actually, the violence has got even worse. From 2010, there have been more police firings, but you will never see mention of them in the media because the media is too much under the control of the Tata group. So, tremendous violence going on in the tribal areas, and what is often called a structural violence. It's, in a way, when I first was living in Orissa, I was meeting the SP of the district where I was living, and as an introduction, I gave him a copy of my book, Sacrificing People, Invasions of a Tribal Landscape. And sitting with me opposite the desk, he read the preface to himself, and then he said, in the preface you have said that during British times, when the police started to go to the tribal villages, they would customarily demand bribes. And you have said that still now, when the police go to tribal villages, the same thing is happening. And I'm afraid you are correct. And I took that as a great confirmation in a way, that the structures of power go back a long way. And if we are to introduce democracy to the tribal areas, it means the overturning of power structures that go very, very deep, which is not to say that the Maoist power structures are also very top-down. They also go back to a particular person, Chairman Mao, who, like corporations, he was a great propagandist, but he was also utterly ruthless, and he also imposed steel production in China that maybe caused the world's biggest famine. So I don't know to what extent the Maoists questioned this, but the power structures that are established, the counterpoise is the democratic structures that are there in the tribal society. So coming to democracy now, in a way I'm going to look at the concept of democracy and the concept of development, and then come back to what's happening now and time for questions. So if you look at the concept of democracy, it was formed in ancient Athens, demokratia, people power, in the 5th century BC. And there were certain very enlightened aspects of that ancient democracy. One was that there's no such word as somebody will develop somebody else or anything like that, although that is how the word is beginning to be used. And I feel very strongly about how some of Charles Darwin's ideas have been misused. So among those is when he was looking at the principle of change, I mean, he was terrified for 20 years to publish The Origin of Species, because this principle of change in nature was heresy in terms of Christian fundamentalism. So, but when he introduced it, he waited 20 years to collect a vast mass of evidence, and then he introduced it, because other people had actually introduced the concept before, but not with that amount of evidence. So he was looking at evolution or development of thousands of species in relation to each other, but thousands of different paths of development. And he was not only looking at competition, what is called now social Darwinism, of like survival of the fittest was not even Darwin's idea. He was not only looking at competition, he was also looking at cooperation between species, and he made many amazing examples of that. So when the idea was applied to society, including by Marx and Engels, but also by Herbert Spencer and by the economists and by many other people, people assumed, they made an assumption that development is in one direction, or it's a kind of monolithic process. So Marx and Engels, I think, very properly formulated the concept of primitive communism. So you can say tribal societies are in some real sense communistic, because the principle of private property is not too strong among tribal societies. Much stronger is a concept of communal property, what is owned in common. So from tribal societies, you can see how in certain places in the world slave-owning societies developed, like in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in Greece, in Rome. And you can see then how feudalism developed, you can see then how capitalism developed. And if you're a socialist, you can theorize about how socialism or advanced communism could develop from that. Whether it's ever been realized so far is debatable. But to say that this is a necessary progression, it's a complete nonsense. There is no evidence for that, if you like. I mean, you can see societies where they have moved in many, many, many different ways. It's a much, much more complex picture than that. So, keeping the argument quite short now, and do ask more on any aspect you're interested in, but within India, you can say that India's constitution, I would say, is among the most enlightened in the world. Not to say it's perfect, but And also, India has some of the best legislation in the world that has again developed over quite a long process of many people and many groups in civil society fighting for better legislation, but often being resisted by other elements. And at the moment, we, in a way, we're in a position where every new act, for example, the Land Acquisition Act, will it be progressive, will it be not be? And if you're looking at PESA and the Forest Rights Act, how much are they implemented? How much can they implement it? Is there a fatal ambiguity built into those acts? I mean, all of these are kind of questions that many of us debate endlessly. In the same way, you could say that Britain doesn't even have a constitution, but America also has quite an enlightened constitution. And what's going on in America now with the battle over surveillance and the whistleblowers, and if, as seems to many of us and many people in America, the laws protecting whistleblowers are really under attack, or that laws protecting free journalism are really under attack, then what's happening with these people of Edward Snowden, Bradley Manning, who's just been condemned to a long jail sentence, Glenn Greenwald, who has been kind of his partner under attack in Britain a few days ago, and is one of the kind of spirits who's really trying to bring things out. I mean, these are of tremendous relevance here. In a way, partly what I'm doing is trying to show the connections between World Bank policies, or what's decided in America and Britain, still are having a massive impact here. And part of that is because in the wars that America and Britain and other countries have been waging in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in a way by remote control in Libya and Syria, in Yemen and Somalia, where the drone attacks have been escalating, in Pakistan too. In a way, it's a pattern of war that is, apart from what is happening in those countries, it's also setting a very bad example to the rest of the world. And that's why what happened in Sri Lanka and the end of the LTT and the kind of massacres in there, what is happening in the Maoist areas, and because, among other things, among the democratic principles was, for example, the Geneva Convention. And the Geneva Convention, in the modern so-called war on terror, has been just thrown out of the window. The Kurdish people, the PKK, one of the groups, I mean, even more than Nelson Mandela's African National Congress, they've been scrupulous in observing the Geneva Convention even now. And I mean, in a way, what would contribute to democracy in the tribal areas is, more than anything else, simply the application of the laws. And especially if a Dalit or an Adivasi can go to a police station when there has been an abuse by men in uniform, register an FIR, and expect justice in the courts, I mean, you would have democracy immediately in the tribal areas, because the abuses by the security forces, which have been written about by some of the more progressive policemen, such as Ian Ramohan, that I don't know if any of you have followed that. It would change the situation immediately if the security forces personnel were also subject to the rule of law. Simply, just to put it like that. Another aspect of development that I'd like to come to is what is being called development is nearly always determined by funding. So, because the World Bank is like this apex organization, if they're talking about a waterfall like Kandadhara, in the whole POSCO movement, what is very little talked about is Kandadhara is this mountain range in North Orissa that POSCO wants to mine, and already there is a massive mine up there. And the Kandadhara waterfall is the highest waterfall in Orissa. It's one of the highest in India, and personally it's the most beautiful place I have seen in India. And the Pauri Bhuya tribe live there and they consider it as sacred. So, but in a waterfall is a very, very highly developed feature of an ecosystem, you could say. It's one of the apex forms of an ecosystem. And with the mining above there, already the waterfall flow is dwindling. So a waterfall is not considered a developed system because it needs no investment. Nobody invested in that river and made a waterfall. It's happened through the power of nature. In the same way, the tribal communities who are being displaced in their hundreds, they're not considered developed because I remember NALCO, when NALCO commissioned a study of when they first set up India's first big aluminium project in Koraput. They were talking about displacement and the rehabilitation of the people, which has been appalling there. And they talk about, we are building for the people paka houses. Unfortunately, the tribal people had only kacha houses made of mud, of no economic value. And if you're looking at this, if you contrast an Adivasi house, which is often, it's made of natural materials, it's made often by the whole community together. It's, because of the materials it's made of and the way it's constructed, it stays relatively cool in summer and it retains a bit of heat in winter. It has lots of kind of specific cultural spaces within it. It's often very beautifully painted in clays. It's a very, very highly developed thing, but not in economic terms. So then if you're looking at the displacement that comes, I mean, the population of Adivasis, if it's doing a very, very rough calculation, if the population of Adivasis in India is about 80 million, is that about the population? So, and Walter Fernandez estimates the total number of people displaced as approximately 40 million, and approximately 50% of those being Adivasis. That's a really rough calculation, but that means approximately 20 million Adivasis, or approximately a quarter of the ST population, has already been displaced. And what are the conditions of that displaced people? It is like really a hell on earth. For 99% of the tribal people displaced by any project, any dam, any mining or mining factory project, you could say the standard of living is dropping in a cataclysmic way. And people call it development-induced displacement, but the tribal people themselves are saying, how can you call this development? For us, it's anti-development or de-development. So instead, people are beginning to call it investment-induced displacement, because what cannot be contested is investment is the force that is displacing them, because it is the money coming in. So this, in a way, the economists often consider FDI, or foreign investment, as an automatic good for the country. But a lot of that investment is in the form of debt. And in the last few days, some of you may have seen, India's 10 biggest corporations are massively in debt. Any new dam, something like 70% of the funding is allowed to be in the form of debt. So in the recent book that I've co-authored with a couple of eminent economists, and it's called Ecology Economy, and you'll find it for sale out there. The last but one chapter is called Investment in a Financial System Based on Debt. And in a way, what is money? And if you look at the history of money, I'm suddenly going to give you a very quick crash course in the history of money. That the first coins were minted again to pay ancient Greek mercenaries who were going to fight in Egypt and in what's now Turkey about 2,600 years ago. And from that time until around the 1980s, you had gold, silver, and copper as the basis of money. And then when the gold standard fell, and then you had paper money, and then you had more and more electronic money. So if you're looking at how money, and even a quotation by a retired, he doesn't say when he's the manager of the Bank of England, he said it after he's retired, that actually the general idea is that when a bank lends you money, it's something that you gradually repay. This is complete and utter nonsense. Actually, the bank itself is forming new money then, and it's money that doesn't actually exist, is what he's saying. So much of modern money is based on debt. The whole financial system, I would say, needs a basic rethink. And to bring the, I feel it's time for questions, so I would like to bring it to a kind of relatively rapid end at this point, having raised these questions, that there is a lot that needs to be learned from the tribal people, as Raiku was saying. And not a lot that we can learn from them, a lot that we have to learn from them, especially in terms of learning to live with restraint. I mean, where maybe everybody would agree on what is development would be development would be where everybody would be coming into well-being in terms of food security, in terms of water security, in terms of work, in terms of equal rights, and so on. Once I went with a group of Dongria to Delhi, and when they saw Delhi for the first time, I mean, people in Delhi may be thinking the Dongria are kind of some primitive tribe, but when the Dongria were seeing Delhi, they were really shocked. They said, what kind of primitive people conditions people are living in the city? They saw the danger of cars. They saw the poverty and the dirt on the streets. And they saw no food growing anywhere. They were saying, where is the food coming from? Where is the water? There is no stream to bathe in here. So, I mean, if you like, the tribal people are living in areas of tremendous resource wealth, as it's now understood, of water, of the minerals under the soil, of the forest. But it's not just by chance they're living there. They have protected them for hundreds, even thousands of years. And so when they're thrown off that land and they're suddenly denied those resources, as the British began that process by alienating them from the forest, then it's not just a tribal problem, it's really a problem for the whole country. And again, this new book emphasizes this, if you're looking just at the water situation in the country, it gives grounds for tremendous concern. Even just the groundwater. I mean, when I first came to this country 34 years ago, the rivers were big rivers. Now they're often just like muddy trickles. They've been so much dammed, they've been so much polluted. But the groundwater is even worse. And in Punjab, before the Green Revolution, in most of Punjab, more than 90%, groundwater was there within 30 meters. Now you have to go down more than 300 meters, and the water, even then, you have to go down double that to get it, or it's polluted with fluoride or so on. So the water systems of the country, not just tribal, because it's very important to insist it's not just Adivasis who have been living in this way. In the Posco area, the betel nut cultivation system, in the Nandigram and Singur areas where they were basically Dalits fighting, they had very sophisticated agriculture systems. So the struggles of communities simply to stay on the land where they have developed and where they have developed for years in their own system are really, I think, the cutting edge of democracy and of development in not just this country but the whole world. So on that note, I end my talk. Thank you for your attention.
Now the presentation is open for a discussion. I don't think you need any further explanation. All that Felix was saying was, development and democracy are not defined by the superpowers. That's the major contention one could see from his presentation. And this development and another thing is development and democracy are based on top-down approach. Okay, instead of bottom-up approach. And that is where the whole problem is. I mean, there is a mismatch between the democracy and development defined by the superpowers and the kind of development and democracy exists at the grassroots level. Means the grassroots level, the tribal in the tribal areas, the very notion of democracy and development is quite different. Okay, but from the above, means the state is imposing a different kind of development model, a different kind of democracy. The best example I could tell you, I should tell you, is recent PESA Act. Here, Ramakrishna Garu is here, Sekti organization, Sivaram Krishna. He must tell us the real experience with the PESA Act. See, in tribal areas before this PESA Act, there was a participatory democratic kind of system. Means if the villagers wanted to take a decision on any of the resources of their village, the whole village collectively take decision. Means the whole village will participate in the decision making. But now after the PESA Act, now you have Gram Sabha. And in this Gram Sabha, you have 7-8 representatives elected by again the villagers. And now if you can manage this out of the 4, 6, 7, 50%, if you can manage, you can now get a hold in the village and you can grab it. You can grab the resources of the villages. This is what happening with the democracy defined by the superpowers. So, I mean, it's a quite a strange thing. So now I am sure you'll be having a lot of questions and comments on Felix's presentation. So I welcome you all.
Thank you for this excellent presentation. Just one single question. To what extent the matter of money creation has been covered in your book?
Yeah, could you introduce first yourself?
Okay. Yeah. My name is Andrei. I'm an economist, like I suppose you as well. You just didn't fail to notice, the money creation is at the root of the whole thing, right? So that what I'm asking. To what extent you cover this issue in your book? My question is just very brief. To what extent is a matter of money creation and the systems which are in place was that I addressed in your book?
Systems are utterly in question. Yes, the 7th chapter, I would say, is very original in looking at how the money is created and in this whole question. So if you're interested in that aspect, I think you'll find it very, very exciting. I don't know if you've heard of a book by Asim Srivastava and Ashish Kothari called Churning the Earth, The Making of Global India. So at my book launch a few days ago in Delhi, I had Asim Srivastava, who, he was saying this is a book every economist ought to read because, especially this aspect of how money is based on debt, it's fundamental. And it's, ancient Britain was also seen as rich in minerals by the Romans. Seneca, the philosopher, lent 40 million sesterces to the British tribes, and then he demanded it back. So just like the World Bank, money lending was being used 2,000 bloody years ago by the Romans. If you think of that, it shows the extent of how deep-seated the problem is. We tend to think of, this is a modern thing, but some of these power structures go back quite a long way. Thank you, and I hope to meet you afterwards and read the book, I hope.
So I'm Srinivas. I'm doing my PhD in ELE department. Sir, I have a question. As you counter the present segregation like developing, developed and underdeveloped countries, which is based on Human Development Index, which includes health, education and per capita income. So do you have any alternative to measure development? Why I'm asking this question? Because our National Development Report, it defines development as politically participative, socially just, aesthetically enjoyable, economically inclusive and so on and so forth. So do we have any alternative measurement or method to see the development? And I have one more question. So whenever the mainstream society attack on Adivasis or Dalits, they are always taking shelter under the theory of survival of the fittest. So how do we see that?
Okay. The first question, I think part of the trouble is the Human Development Index. It gives things you can measure. It gives basically the health and the education literacy level and the income level. And if you apply these three to Adivasi societies, you're going to completely miss what is developed in tribal societies, because Adivasi society has its own system of medicine, and you can say quite a lot of people, the fault of that system might be quite a lot of children do die in infancy, and women do die in labor. So there's no question, I think, of that. But in terms of other healing systems, and very, very sophisticated ones, that cannot be measured by this system. In terms of education, also, they have forms of knowledge that they pass on informally without a school system. And again, that's completely missed in this. Literacy, I have a wonderful quote from an American Indian leader where he says, normally, I reject writing because it's the form of dominating peoples, how they try to dominate other peoples. And my culture, the Lakota culture, does not use writing. I reject normally writing. So if you have just literacy itself is obviously a valuable tool, but some of the illiterate people I've met are among the wisest people I've met too. So it's not, again, to measure literacy is not, it's a very biased form of measurement. With income especially, I mean, a lot of tribal people have not used money or have not been so much part of the market system till recently. So the Human Development Index is a very flawed system. And the trouble is, what is given power is quantification. Since the Chicago School of Economics, it had that maxim, almost knowledge depends on measurement. And yet, many of the most important things are things that cannot be measured. So it's like Bhutan has this happiness development index where, I mean, so the answer to that is not easy, because it's not easy for planners to understand, if you like, qualitative aspects that cannot be measured. But that doesn't mean they don't exist or are not very, very real. So this is important to understand, and then it's a much longer answer and complex. To do with the survival of the fittest and this, what's called social Darwinism, it's, in a way, what Darwin was opposing was the idea that man is at the center of creation. But, if you like, Christian fundamentalist idea that all the other species have been created for man to enjoy. But how the idea, through this monolithic idea of evolution or development, we've come to a state where, as you say, the economists or those people who take economics as central, they think only the fittest will survive, meaning if our dams or our big construction projects destroy a lot of other species or a lot of other societies, it doesn't matter at all, because we're the fittest, and they're then using Darwin to justify a system that has come back to the pre-Darwin idea of modern civilized society is at the center of nature, when what Darwin is showing is precisely the opposite. And another way he was showing it is that he was showing how man is part of nature. And this is what was especially heretical to a lot of the Christian fundamentalists, that he showed in the bone structure, in the expression of emotions, in every way, man is very closely related to chimpanzees and gorillas and monkeys and fish and all the other creatures. And this is a way where tribal society is also in the myths. Tiger is our mum, and it's our uncle, and all the other in myths that some might see, all the species of insects and plants and animals and fish and birds are our relatives. And this is another way where I see Darwin as, and as it were, remembering what he was actually saying would be very helpful to counteract this rather stupid survival of the fittest mentality. Thank you.
Thank you for your wonderful enlightening talk, Professor. I am Vagish from Nalsar University of Law. By listening to you, I think anthropocentrism, which is dominating at a philosophical level, at a scientific level, and elsewhere, what is the alternative to this? Because the anthropocentrism is just eating things almost. Now, anthropocentrism becomes Eurocentrism, and once Eurocentrism becomes a different model of the Cartesian philosophy which goes in and all that. So what is, because your experience with Adivasis, whom you're rightly putting as people who have their own ecosystemic understanding and then they have their own perception of living. I just don't want to use the word development per se. So what will be the alternative? Because in the context of democracy and development, which are very loaded, and then how to counter the anthropocentric, Eurocentric, money-centric models of development and democracy? What are the alternatives?
I remember a joke that my sister told me, and I want to begin with that. It's a couple of planets are traveling in the heavens, okay, and they haven't met each other for a few thousand years, and they're suddenly coming close to each other, and how are you? And one of them says, I'm not feeling very well, actually. And the other one says, yes, you don't look very well. What's the matter with you? And the planet says, I've got these humans in my planet, and they're rather damaging me. And the other planet says, oh, don't worry, they don't last for very long. It's a disease, it wipes itself out quite quickly. And, in terms of a very big view, you could say if human beings are an experiment, we're really on the fast track to self-destruct. Whatever that means. I mean, it could be through nuclear, it could be through climate change, it could be through about a dozen other ways at the moment. So, coming back to what I mentioned about the Kurds, Öcalan's great question in these books that he's been writing from jail is, could human beings develop to what could really be called a democratic civilization? And a democratic civilization would have to be very, very strong on what is a correct use of resources, not overusing resources. So, as well as founded on democratic principles, instead of, we are still being run by an elite who have almost, I think, come to a position where, in a kind of Malthusian way, because Malthus was a big influence on Darwin and Wallace and other people, where people are overpopulating, most of the working class are, or the tribal people, or these people supporting them, they are not very intelligent, they're not, in the market term, very sophisticated. It doesn't matter if they're wiped out. And they're actually developing forms of warfare that might be wiping out a lot of the population quite soon. So I think what has to be opposed to that, if human beings could be an experiment that will actually survive for a few thousand years more, we would have to develop quite fast a radical forms of democracy that, I mean, if you're looking in terms of how to control power. Like, power corrupts. We take this for granted, or history repeats itself. Why? Because people study history and then they think those patterns are like part of human nature. But, you know, human nature is a very open book. We have some very bad, very greedy aspects, very cool aspects, and we have some much better aspects. So, could we develop a system where we control power and we make sure that power does not corrupt? I would say in developing a truly democratic system where we put some limits on power and some limits on wealth, we haven't developed very much for 2,000 years. In terms of how to control wars, I mean, we have even now some wonderful people in many countries devoted to trying to find peace. But in terms of how to control wars, unfortunately the superpower is, or the developed countries are setting an incredibly bad example at the moment. And we haven't even begun to control our wars. And again, I'd say no development really in this particular human species for 2,500 years. Tell me when there's some real development. It's like, so the power, how to control power, how to control use of resources, in terms of, we've taken it for granted that cars are a good thing. That, I mean, if you look at here, I mean, this is a very nice campus, but instead of using natural light, we're using this electricity. And I mean, it's a massive overuse of resources that we've taken for granted. I travel every year between countries by aeroplanes. But how long will these aluminium birds go on flying? I mean, the overuse of resources of both the oil and the aluminium is obscene, actually. So what we have been taught to think of as a developed society is in some ways an overdeveloped society in certain respects, while tremendously underdeveloped in terms of community and democratic values. So, but this has to seep through. It doesn't even have to seep down, because I think a lot of people at the grassroots understand it. It has to seep up. So, I mean, you know, that's a short answer to your question, but this is the kind of rethinking that has to be done, which those ideas are already there. There have been wonderful writers and wonderful thinkers and wonderful grassroots movements, but there have to be through the universities, and this is where I would say there has to be a conjoining of academic knowledge with activist knowledge of really to try to influence the people who are making the key decisions. So that's a very brief answer.
There are two problems. One is what we learn in universities is irrelevant to a tribal, because tribal is he has to deal with a patwari, forest guard, police and all those things. And in our knowledge system, you know, we don't read revenue maps, land maps, survey numbers and all those things. That knowledge is almost missing in our education. And the second thing is about the tribal traditions. In analyzing the knowledge, traditional knowledge or oral tradition of tribals, you know, and our university's higher education is the least equipped. In the sense, you know, most of the time, you know, we spend on literary criticism on written culture, not on unwritten cultures. Yeah, the cognitive maps, the belief systems, the semantic domains, and the binary structure. And we are not spending much time. So when 8% of population in India is tribals, our syllabus also should comprise 8% of tribal items or practices, you know. Yeah. So, and that knowledge, you know, should address both these things, the governance as well as the traditional governance. Governance is both, it is traditional and political. So we are unable to address that gap, you know. We should, as academicians, you know, so we should address that. Then things may change in course of time.
as an extension to the point raised by the immediately, by the speaker who's just spoke, I think, yes, I think we have completely ignored some sections of our society and then have taken them for granted. And of course, in your presentation, you also stated that we have to learn a lot from cultures of such society, such communities. So, I think we can find some alternatives by observing them carefully and then analyzing their situations and then the way they are living in harmony with nature. When somebody raised a question as what are the alternatives, you couldn't really answer we couldn't give a specific answer. Can you reflect again and then draw any particular points, one or 2 points that you have observed from the tribals, from various tribal groups that you saw and interacted with, and then enlighten us on those things?
Thank you. Yes, and finding alternatives is very important in articulating that. One of the alternatives I would point to is Niyamgiri, and simply because I know that area quite well, that you're seeing democracy at work there, and democracy, I would say, has worked there. You're also seeing alternatives, there's no one paradigm, and that's the point. It's a radical, if you like, decentralization that has to happen, because there are democratic initiatives everywhere, if you look. But they're often being suppressed or they're being taken over by, funding agencies or whatever. So, but in this alternative, you could say there are certain principles that have to be there. One would be the restraints towards nature. One would be the knowledge that is already there in communities about nature and also